So I want to bring greetings from our co-executive directors, Evelyn Sue and Martin Reynolds of the Maynard Institute. There's going to be several objectives for today. And the first one is to talk about the history of the Maynard Institute. Also, we'll introduce the tool, Fault Lines, to help you think about the way you approach your work, the conversations you have with sources, people in the community, and even conversations that you have with people inside your newsrooms. We're going to establish a language and a terminology that you can use. We'll also talk about your blind spots and what biases you carry, because everyone carries bias. We're going to examine bias in media coverage, and then we'll talk about solutions to managing those blind spots. And like I said, anything else that is on your mind, feel free. And this is as Rachel said, an open conversation. So as I'm talking about things, if you have questions, I'm going to prompt you, but if you have questions, please feel free to stop and ask. So I'm going to start with the Kerner Commission. I know many of you are familiar with Kerner Commission, and it came together after the rebellion in Detroit in 1967. And that was after a series of rebellions that had started years before that. And it was after this one in particular that President Lyndon Johnson said, it's time to really examine what is causing these cities to erupt. So a year later, 1968, the commission released their report, and what they found was that it was lack of economic opportunities, lack of social services, police brutality that led to many of these rebellions. And it also said that the white-oriented media was responsible for much of the entrenched racism. And I thought this quote was so powerful. If the media are to report with understanding, wisdom, and sympathy on the problems of cities and problems of the Black man, they must employ, promote, and listen to Negro journalists. So 9 years later, a diverse group of journalists founded the Institute for Journalism Education. And the goal was to diversify America's newsrooms by using diverse journalists to train them. So the very first program kicked off 2 years later, 1979, with the summer program. And our co-executive director, Evelyn Sue, is one of the members of that first class of the summer program. Many of you are familiar with the name Kevin Merida, the founding editor of The Undefeated, who is now the first Black executive editor of the LA Times. They both came out of that first class. Then a few years later became the editing program. I am a proud graduate of the editing program. Had it not been for that program, I wouldn't have had the career that I had. And then in the early 2000s was the Management Training Center, which Deborah Adams Simmons was a graduate of. At the end of the 2000s and the Management Training Center was run out of, I should go back. The summer program was out of UC Berkeley. The editing program was University of Arizona. The Management Training Center came out of Northwestern. The Maynard Media Academy was sponsored by Harvard for several years. We also had a program, and this will resume once we're really post-pandemic, but Converse and Convene. And that would be a two-day session in DC where journalists of all levels came together to talk about issues in the industry. We have a program called Oakland Voices, where we train residents of Oakland, California to be community journalists. And our current program, Maynard 200, is a goal of diversifying 200 diverse storytellers in several tracks: storytelling, entrepreneurship, executive leadership, and we're kicking off a new program for frontline editors and new managers, and that will be led by our executive, our board chair, John X. Miller, and I'm the deputy track chief. And so a plug for that, today is the last day to apply, so if you're interested, let me know, I'll give you more details, but it's a completely free program, and it's run out of USC and Annenberg schools, so we will be in person this year, and we're really grateful for that. So we are approaching our 45th anniversary this year, which is just incredible. And I wanted to go back to this. Seated at the table in the center of the table is Robert Maynard. He was the first Black executive editor, publisher, and eventual owner of the Oakland Tribune in the Bay Area. And so he was a visionary and just, had these awesome quotes. And I love this one. The country cannot be the country we want it to be if its story is told by only one group of citizens. Our goal is to give Americans front door access to the truth. And then that's something that we strive for still today. And because of his vision, when he died in 1993, the board decided to rename the institute after him. So it is the Robert C. Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. So here we are, 50 plus years after the Kerner Commission Report, and the same issues they found in that report still exist today. Lack of employment, police brutality, lack of social services. It was interesting that there's this article pointing that out. And so, 2020 was crazy. The deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Not only did it get individuals time to think about, it's time to stop. We got to stop this madness. It also led news organizations to examine their coverage. And a lot of that was led by journalists like yourself who said, we demand change. One example, I worked with the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, and they wrote a manifesto and said, this is what we want. And they are making incredible changes. And so, I found this this illustration from Columbia Journalism Review, and I thought it just really captured the moment of 2020. I'm just one of the very first apologies came from the Florida Times Union in Jacksonville. How many of you had heard of Axe Handle Sunday or Saturday? Yeah, it wasn't until Trump wanted to hold his first in-person rally in Jacksonville on the anniversary of that incident that any of us were made aware of it. And the newspaper apologized because of their lack of coverage and acknowledgement of Axe Handle Saturday. Then the LA Times apologized for their horrible coverage of Black and brown communities, and that led to many changes and why Kevin Merida is there today. Let me go back. Then the Kansas City Star apologized for their coverage as well as their staffing. Recently, the Baltimore Sun has done the same, and then we have A More Perfect Union. And this is a full examination, an ongoing examination of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Wesley Lowery, many of you I'm sure are familiar with his work. He's leading that effort, really looking at how did they get there. And so, newspapers have to have, and editors have had to realize there's systemic, that's what racism is systematic racism and exclusion. And what role have editors played in that? So this has been just a real awakening for our industry. And so at the same time, while we were going, the industry was going through an evolution of sorts, we were too at the Maynard Institute. It's like, okay, we need to go beyond just simply integrating newsrooms, and should it be equity in service of diversity? So after talking with a lot of folks in the industry and just what things we should be doing, co-executive director Martin Reynolds decided we need to really focus on equity and belonging, because that's what people are looking for in newsrooms. So in September of 2020, we launched Vision 25, Building Racial Equity in Newsrooms. And this is a partnership with ONA and Open News. And the goal is to really create anti-racist organizations, train organizations how to be anti-racist in its coverage and hiring, and where you can create institutions of belonging. And when so when you're talking about belonging, people want to feel it's a place where you can really be you and free of judgment. It's in the type of leadership that exists. Do you have managers with high emotional intelligence? That's what an institution of belonging would have. And that's where you would feel like you can report on the stories you want to report without, as a friend of mine calls, black doubt or brown doubt, right? It's the sourcing you can utilize, and it's the equitable pay that you receive for doing the same work as a white male colleague. So we have a Belonging in the News series, and this is where we have conversations with leaders in the industry. We kicked off the first one in September 2020 with Nicole Hannah-Jones. And then we followed up the next month with Maria Hinojosa, the host of Latino USA and CEO and President CEO of Futuro Media Group. We followed up with Wesley Lowry in 2021. And then journalists Lewis Wallace and Manolia Charlatan. And they are the founders of Press On. It's a Southern movement journalism collective where we're really getting to the roots of anti-racism and how to eliminate that in journalism. Then we talked with Salil Danby-Ho, the food critic of the San Francisco Chronicle, and then Jeff Chang, who is a senior advisor at Race Forward. So this series will kick off again probably in May. And so when it does, we'll be posting that all over social. We'll send the information to you all and to get it out to you as well. But this is something that we really feel strongly about, is this sense of feeling invited, not only at the table, but having a real stake in making change. So I want to spend a few minutes, at the root of a lot of the issues that we have, in coverage and communities is the lack of trust. And I thought it was interesting that Gallup started measuring trust in the media in the early 70s. And you see that 68% of Americans trusted the media, but you go down to 2021 and it was down to 13%. And it's just like, wow. I mean, that's why when you on Twitter, you look at the comments, there is no trust. And there's reasons for the lack of trust and ways that we can do better. And so in 2017, the Trust Project was created to build standards in trust. And this was led by Sally Lehrman, and it was to talk to members of the public, media organizations, as well as tech partners, Google, Facebook, and Bing, and to establish core indicators of trust. And what's interesting is that when you're talking about trust, diverse voices comes up in two places. The very first one, under just best practices, what are your standards? Who fund, being transparent about who funds your organization, and then being committed to ethical journalism, commitment to incorporating diverse voices, as well as accuracy, which is a basic, right? And then even acknowledging corrections. And then you get down, and diverse voices has its own indicator. And this is a newsroom's efforts to bring in diverse perspectives. And so when you're thinking about trust, the way the public sees this is being representative of them. And why, if you don't see people that look like you, or you don't know that people that look like you are reporting the news, you may feel some kind of way, right, about this particular story and how it was framed. So that's why, we are always, talking about trust, because we're in this era where we have to work so hard to rebuild it. So that leads me to the fault lines. And this is, when we're talking about fault lines, it's how we align ourselves across social fault lines produce bias. And it shows up in the stories that we put at the top of a website, stories that run on 1A. Again, the sources that are used are not used in stories. It's all of those things. So the creation of fault lines. How many is there anyone from the Bay Area here? Oh, got one. Yeah.
I live in Oakland, but I'm not from.
Well, okay, but yeah, I'm sure you've heard about this earthquake in 1989. And it was actually the largest earthquake to hit California since 1906 today. It registered 6.9 magnitude. It was, as you can see by this picture, it was horrific. And it registers for me because it was, I think it was October 17th of that year, and I got married 4 days after that. And my husband's family is all in the Bay Area. And it was like, can they even get here? But they finally, they got there the day before, thank God. But yeah, so this really, for me to talk about a program, this impacts me as well as it was my family was impacted by this earthquake. But it was the Loma Prieta earthquake. And in the 70s, the state of California began retrofitting the highways and all the infrastructure for earthquakes. But it was this one particular stretch in Oakland called the Cypress Freeway that wasn't reinforced. They said, oh, it's structurally sound. And unfortunately, there's a little history with this section of freeway. This was a section, like in many cities, was disrupted, was the Black community, and they decided that they needed access to get to another side, so they just cut right through the Black community. They did it in Detroit, they did it in Louisville, I know they've done it in a lot of cities. And unfortunately, this was the section that wasn't reinforced. But yet this was the section where the most people died, 42 in fact. So, when they began to do the reporting at the Oakland Tribune, this is Bob Maynard. He was a reporter at the York Gazette in Pennsylvania and at the Washington Post. So he started as a reporter, as they're bringing in the information. He's looking at it like, wow, these things, they didn't reinforce the highway systems. Well, maybe journalism needs to serve as a reinforcement for society. Because when you think about segments of your life, they have called societal ruptures. And what was interesting too, he covered many of the societal ruptures of the 60s, like the women's liberation movement, the Vietnam War protests. So this is where he came up with the framework for the fault lines. So this is where he saw race, class, gender, generation, and geography as those forces in our lives that have played such a pivotal role. It's the things that have created our perceptions of ourselves, perceptions of others. So in 2019, we created a sixth fault line of sexual orientation. And when you think about the fault lines, these are the things that have all been legislated over decades, right? These are just issues that have been monumental and they're personal for all of us, yet they're different for all of us, right? So fault lines can shape the way we see events. It's important how we frame. That's why framing is important, because depending on our experiences, our life experiences, is how we frame and shape stories. Again, they represent issues that have shaped society and divided the country. Fault lines can help explain why, if you've ever been in a meeting and you come out of the meeting, you talk to somebody about the meeting, you have two different perspectives of what happened in the meeting. I remember that a lot. My deputy features editor, we could come out of the budget meeting and she heard one, and I said, that's not what he said, that's not how, so we interpreted things differently, but that's because our fault lines are not in the same place, okay? And again, these 6 fault lines are the common ways we identify ourselves. And so people ask, well, what about politics? And what about religion? Well, we call those social fissures. And while those two are huge in our lives, they run through every one of the 6 fault lines. They're very adjacent. They're intersectional, right? And disability is another one too. And that is actually one that we're thinking, oh, maybe that should be a 7th fault line as well. So when you think about newsroom fault lines, it's about, again, how journalists see the world through their lived experiences, their personal fault lines. And so we have to be really conscious about how these biases that we carry manifest themselves and not allow them to slip into coverage. So I'm going to talk about my favorite one is geography. And when you look at the geography fault line, it encompasses a lot, right? Urban, suburban, rural communities, regions, states, countries, neighborhoods, houses, homelessness, apartments, condominiums. We all have perceptions about people within, this list here. And we have to also think about connotations that come with rural. In fact, when you're talking about rural, people tend to think of people from the country or just rural regions of your states as could be backwoods. And when you're talking about suburban and urban, we heard this a lot in the last election cycle. We know urban is code for black and brown, suburban is code for white. So you just have to be aware of that in your reporting. So when you're talking about, like I said, geography is my favorite one. I live in a very old suburban community outside of Detroit. And whenever it's portrayed on TV, these are the images that you see. But if you were to come to my house and hang out on my deck, this is what you'd see. That's me and my son when he was a little kid. He's 28 now. He's probably like, why'd you put that in there, Mom? But I just wanted to say, you know, this is kind of like even in Detroit, in reporting about Detroit. Rachel knows this. Every time there was images, ABC News was taking a task for this piece they did on what was called, formerly known as Devil's Night. We have eradicated Devil's Night in Detroit, but just the burning of Detroit. Oh my God, they're burning down their city. But it was like, okay, go beyond those areas. They're very nice areas in Detroit. But you had, you know, so I always tell new staff, particularly, well, all staffers, editors and reporters, drive through your communities. Take different routes to, you know, work and church and your favorite places. Drive through places you've never been so that when story ideas come up or people are talking about areas, you can say, no, it's not quite like that. I've been through there, you know, so you have perspectives of your entire community, just not the area where you work or the routes that you commonly take. Because these are the kind of biases that play into coverage through the geography fault line. So race and class, and these fault lines are intersectional, right? So when the country shut down, we were like, okay, what do we do now? Because literally we were working with the Philadelphia Inquirer when the country shut down. It was like, oh, okay, so Martin had the idea that let's do a best practice series through the fault lines during the pandemic, coronavirus. And that best practice series is on our Medium channel. And it's got just, you know, beyond COVID tips, it's really, you know, fault lines reporting tips. So if you're ever curious about the 6 fault lines, you can go to that and see where all that information is. But my colleague Jean Marie Brown decided to write on race, and she was examining coverage just strictly based on race. And this story in particular, she focused on the issues of bias in the medical community, which I know all of you all were reporting on that issue in the last 2 years. And I looked at the issue of class through the lens of Detroit. You may have heard in the early days of the pandemic, this man here, Jason Hargrove, was a bus driver for Detroit Department of Transportation. And one of his passengers got on the bus and intentionally coughed on him. And he died 2 weeks later of COVID. And that was really the impetus for the state to get masks. You know, when you couldn't find masks and they, you know, it was just, this man was doing everything he could do to provide for his family, and he left a wife and 6 children. And the house next to his picture is a home in Grosse Pointe Farms. Now, the Grosse Pointes is one of the wealthiest enclaves in the country. There's 5 of them. Farms is the wealthiest. So while COVID was ravaging Detroit, it was an epicenter, as you all know, in the early days, they had like 0.01% of COVID. And you look at the stark differences in class. And so that's what I wrote about in that piece. But you know, there's so many class issues still today that we need to, in their stories that we need to tell. So when you're looking at the gender fault line, there's so much to write about in gender. But if you look at the vast majority of coverage on the gender fault line, it is very cisgendered. But you go to Facebook, there's 56 choices for, you know, gender. Tinder, third is Tinder. And no, not after the Tinder swindler. No, I don't think so. But 37, right? And you know, one of the things, you know, Maynard, we've worked with so many newspapers. We're working with TV stations. We're working with public radio. And one of the exercises we take them through is how well do you know your community? And surprisingly, a lot of organizations think they know, and they really don't. So one of the surprises is that we have 2 questions based on poverty. And the one that comes up every time, which group do you think lives highest in poverty? And it's, well, let me ask, who do you think, if you had to take a guess, what demographic group is the highest living in poverty? Just random. Transgendered women of color? Okay. Someone else? Okay.
I would say maybe white. I don't even think gender, just white people might be a high side.
Numerically?
Yes, yes.
Well, it is white women between 18 and 34. And you never see their coverage. And every time we do the exercise, it's just like, whoa, really? And then that's followed by, women of color. So it's just, and just in general, women 18 to 34. And so, when we were the child tax care credit, that was the big news last year, but it was very little coverage. Some places had it, but there was the opportunity to really report through that fault line. And maybe if there were more women in positions of power, we would see those stories. But as reporters, you can bring those stories to light and say, this is what we need to report on. But it's just an interesting thing. When you start looking at it through these lenses, you'll notice where there's discrepancies in coverage. So sexual orientation, more people, as you know, are beginning to identify as LGBTQ. This is information, the most recent information from Gallup. And so again, when you look at the coverage of sexual orientation, it's getting a little better, but it's still from a heteronormative perspective. We need to be more inclusive of including folks. And then generation. We're living at a time where in some industries, there's 4 generations working at the same time, at least 3 in the news industry. And with that becomes a lot of conflict, a lot of friction, a lot of ways of doing things have shifted in a lot of industries. Still hadn't kind of reached journalism yet. But in other industries, they're looking at how do we change what we do to bring in these new hires, millennials and Gen Zs, particularly Gen Zs, right? The most diverse generation. So, and that's where people, boomers and Gen Xers are like, well, wait a minute, I paid my dues and I had to do all of this to get where you want to go. And, Gen Z is like, no, I don't have to do that. I don't even have to stay in this industry because y'all old and antiquated. We'll go somewhere else. But if you want to survive, and have longevity and trust, you got to really focus on generation. There's a question we usually pose to people about, and I want everybody to participate. When you think about what significant news event stands out in your lifetime? 9/11?
Katrina?
Oh, Katrina. What else? 9/11. Well, it doesn't have to be a tragedy. Oh yeah, Barack Obama. Sonny? Well, there you go. Yeah.
The climate strike?
Yeah. What? Okay, I'm hearing some.
The climate strike. The climate strike?
Oh, the climate strike, see? Yeah.
The crash in the atomic. The creation of ice.
Ah, yeah.
Pluto.
Pluto! I love it. Oh, this is great. So that's that's why, even covering all of these events, you have to realize that people see them through a particular lens. Like Sunny and Rachel were saying Vietnam War. For me, that really shaped me was the women's liberation movement. I was, I probably was, I don't know, junior high school or something. And there was this song by an artist, Helen Reddy, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, in numbers too big to ignore. And I was like, yeah. And my mother and my grandmother, they were all progressive women. And I'm like, yeah. And then my husband was like, oh, where did all of this come from? But, I had to always tell him, that was, for me, that was pivotal for me, that women, we can do things. They say we can't, we're not limited. So that was pivotal for me. So that's why even covering issues that reign, the scale, the scope of life events, that's why they're also different for everyone. And that's why it's important to take those into account when you're reporting on those issues. So again, fault line awareness, about taking into account, nuances in stories. It's about understanding self-awareness and to realize that societal fault lines and biases are natural, because we experience things differently. But just because they're there doesn't mean we accept them. That's where that self-awareness plays a huge role in making sure it doesn't seep into content. Affinity bias. It means you have way too many people in your circle who are like you. So it basically means, we gravitate toward people who are like us and we hold them in favorable terms. But it's like, how does our affinity bias impact hiring decisions, the way stories are signed, who's covering those stories? And when you think about, there's so many biases, and in our trainings, we used to go through a lot of them, but for time's sake, we really just focus on affinity bias. Affinity bias, because affinity bias is the one that shows up across the board everywhere, right? So that's going to lead us into just talking about, unconscious implicit bias, which, are the stereotypes that lead to racist and sexist outcomes. And so then when you look at unconscious bias in journalism, it's the questions that we ask sources, and it's the way we actually even listen to people. Or how do we associate certain actions? Are we associating them with criminality? Or are we defending certain actions? And then who are we seeing as an empathetic character in the story? And so you wonder, how does it show up? And it's usually these four factors: when there's ambiguity, when there's stress from competing tasks, time pressure and deadlines, or just lack of diversity on staff. That lack of having someone to turn to ask a question where you're making that assumption. So the important thing when folks say, oh, I'm woke, I don't carry any bias. Well, it's like, no. We call that Overwoke Syndrome. Because even when you think you don't carry bias, we all carry bias, okay? So I want to spend a little time talking about the notion of objectivity. Woo! I see this resonates. Yeah. So I'm going to ask y'all something in a bit, but because I see this is a hot button topic for y'all too. But again, we have all been trained that we have to be objective as journalists, just like we have these robots with no thoughts and histories and experiences, and we can just really go in and cover something without any knowledge of anything, and that's really just a notion. Right? Because we all have experiences based on our personal fault lines. So it's really about being fair and accurate in our coverage. But you know, in 2020, objectivity made the news. Wesley Lowery wrote this op-ed in the New York Times about objectivity and how it's impacted Black journalists. And then when you look at objectivity and the impact on journalists, so you all are familiar with Alexis Johnson at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who was pulled off of protest coverage because she was Black. And same with their Black photographer. She sued them. And so, yeah, she is now at Vice News as a correspondent, probably doing better than she was in Pittsburgh. But the fact that, just that notion, you know, the notion of because you're Black, you can't cover protest coverage. Well, you know, we say if you think about it, if you're white, then you can't cover anything. Because there's a relationship to everything, but why you can say, make that distinction, or it just doesn't make any sense. And then here at the bottom left is reporter Felecia Henderson from the Washington Post, who is a sexual assault survivor, and she was told that she couldn't cover stories about victims of sexual assault. So she's suing them. You know, Nicole Hannah-Jones speaks often, as much as she can, about objectivity. And she was just talking with the Night Media Forum in February. And I thought it was interesting. She said, we need to understand we have points of view versus telling people what our points of view are. You know, are we being honest as ourselves as journalists and our profession? She believes that objectivity of method, which I like that term, is being fair, accurate, portraying all sides of a story honestly and fairly. And she says we need to worry about making our journalism more credible and transparent, and being transparent about the production of journalism. And then in the summer of 2020, Maria Hinojosa was on a show and was interviewed on NPR, and she said, I don't want journalists of color to have to be warriors in order to be able to work as journalists. To be able to work as journalists of conscience who can bring their entire selves into the newsroom, who are going to be seen, who are going to not only be seen and heard, but actually put into positions of power to be the ones who are listening and making the decisions. So it's all that conversation that we were talking earlier, that's belonging. And so you have to understand that objectivity has been weaponized against journalists of color, women, members of the LGBTQ community for decades. And that's why in 2020, journalists of color said, enough is enough. So when you think about bias in coverage, the way it shows up is that, you know, when you're talking about immigration, coverage always reflects, you know, Hispanics. Asian Americans represent 100 different ethnic groups, okay? Black people overrepresented in coverage of poverty. And we know that the largest beneficiaries of welfare are white citizens, but you never see that in stories. Rarely see that in stories, I should say. And then Black people are overrepresented in crime coverage, as we kind of briefly touched on in a minute, where white people are, you know, perpetrators of crime, but we rarely see that. So we're gonna go through some coverage issues. And so I just want to ask you, what do you see? Just anybody, no trick question.
Get through a flood.
Okay, okay, anyone else? Oh, okay. Okay, oh, man.
Structural racism, right? Because of where he lives, he's a black woman, no?
No, I just asked you, what did you see? Just what do you see? See, you went to the next level, but okay. Okay. Well, here was the actual headline in the story. So when you said hurricane, I was like, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm not allowed to say who the news organization is since we're being taped here. Because they were upset that we used them in an example. But when you talk about a person's fault lines and lack of critical mass and ambiguity, the editor on this story didn't know this man was just simply walking across the street in a flooded area after Hurricane, Irene. But his assumption was he was trying to steal the bike. But that's unfortunate. I mean, we're talking about what perceptions people make when they see you. When they see you enter a room, see you crossing the street, oh, you naturally. And again, I don't know if this man is black. I don't know if he's Latino. He could be Italian. I'm just saying, we don't know. But I mean, it's all kind of assumptions, and that's why we had to be careful without making, y'all won't make this mistake in this room, but that's why you're editors. You have to go back and talk about, why this framework and why it's important not to make assumptions like this. So framing, I've talked a little bit about that, about the ways we frame stories. So talking about the Unabomber, the New York Times framed him as a genius, and Ted Kaczynski was a genius, right? But it's the tortured genius of this man, and so then when they were reporting about Michael Brown, it was how he grappled with problems and promise. And most of the time, I would say probably 98% of the time, when there is a problem with a story, it's typically the headline. We'll see another example of that. And that's why as copy editors you have, and I bet you anything, they love that phraseology of problems and promise, because it was like, oh, the contrast. Yeah, the alliteration, and it's like, okay, but y'all created a bigger problem in how you framed this.
As the reporters, a lot of times you don't get to write your own headline.
Well, what I tell reporters is to really, if you can, and now in systems, I know Gannett has, Presto, you can look at the headline, you can see the production of the story. I tell reporters all the time, follow that story through the end, because there's going to be that lone copy editor working at 9 o'clock, slapping a headline on there, and you get the next day or 2 hours later, and you're like, oh my God, that was not the focus of the story. So yeah, follow the trail. Looking at the way that the Sacramento Bee framed the murder of Nipsey Hussle. 4 years before rapper Nipsey Hussle was fatally shot Sunday in his hometown of Los Angeles, a chaotic scene broke out involving gunfire and a person jumping on police cars as the crowd left one of his shows in Sacramento. Police did not link Hussle to the shooting, but the incident sparked a local debate about hip-hop concerts. Now, okay. Contrast that with the LA Times. He hustled, doing whatever he needed to survive. And yeah, he fell into gangbanging, pleading allegiance to the notorious rolling 60s Crip set. Hussle made music for the street hustlers and those of us struggling to make ends meet, and he became a local hero for using the fame and fortune he got from rapping and pouring it back into the neighborhood. That's context, nuance. Whereas whoever wrote the story for the Sacramento Bee just saw crime. They didn't see the humanity and how he had evolved, right? And I would say this story was written by, thank you, Angel Jennings. It was the most read story on their website that year. Yeah. Okay, who and what makes a terrorist? Again, you all remember the Christmas Day bombing in Nashville. A thunderous night, thunderous death and nightmare, okay? Blew himself up, okay? And it was interesting how people interpreted this on social media. Like, this dude was really a suicide bomber. So the issue of women and promiscuity and how, so here is the obit. This was included in the obituary of Aretha Franklin. This is the Washington Post piece. Though these details might sound salacious, and while it would be irresponsible to speculate on what, if any, effect her father's alleged behavior has on Aretha's young life, it does appear to have affected her. What a judgment. What? That's not, why is that even in the story, first of all? So let's get triggered even more. We'll continue the triggerization here. Microaggressions, those everyday slights and snubs that are real, whether intentional or not. They communicate negative and hostile messages that you all have all talked about so far today. Just wanted to give you a little history on the terminology. I thought it was interesting. The term came up first in the 70s from Dr. Charles Pierce, a professor at Harvard who studied it, and then most recently it's from Dr. Daryl Wing Su at Columbia, who writes prolifically on microaggressions. And, they're fueled by our fault lines, blind spots. So there's three types of microaggressions. There's the more common micro insults that you all have talked about, but those are the ones that are most insidious, that really hurt at the core. And people try to defend those comments as jokes or just kind of, I'm telling it like I see it, one that is common, sadly, still used. I thought I could eliminate this example from the presentation, and someone told me, no, I was just told a year ago, you must be the diversity hire. I didn't even know people were still saying that in 2022, The micro assaults are the most severe, and those are the ones that really scare people. They usually happen in large settings, and those are the ones where the offender is actually rebuked or taken to task for that. And then, the micro invalidations are the ways that people respond to, the micro insults. And, those responses like, why is everyone so sensitive? Or why it's just, it's not that big a deal. So, and just want to point out that anyone can commit a microaggression because they're so slight, you don't even realize that you're committing one. And so you're talking about, that's how I feel when you think about when that word, it just triggers So I'm gonna show you all the most recent microaggression, and you all already know this.
However, you do not play against the guys. Like I have to.
Y'all know that face, don't you? That reaction. So there's a lot of things that can be interpreted there. One, we know the face that Venus made because we've all made it. I think Serena understood what she meant, but at the same time, you know, I didn't show the earlier part of that speech where she kept trying to compare herself and say, oh, I'm not as talented as you guys. My serve is terrible, but this is where I beat you. Well, none of that was really even necessary in the speech, right? And yeah, while she thought, oh, she's making a joke, that was a microaggression. That's a microaggression. And she later apologized for it, but it's just like, come on. Those are the things that get you in trouble all the time. So, you know, talking about, you know, microaggressions when it comes to race, you know, when there's a black person and a white person in the room and the person walks in and naturally assumes that the white person is the manager, and it's not, it couldn't be the black person. Again, the assumption that only white people are leaders, managers. Somebody brought this up earlier, like people of the same race, why aren't you like them, or why aren't they like you? That issue of exceptionalism, right? Here we go, where are you from? You talked about that. You know, implicit bias that people of non-European descent are perpetual foreigners in their own country. You can't be, you know, from here. The one that just drives me crazy is you are so articulate, you know? And that you usually see written about primarily black males. Like, you know, there's no way, I can't believe you actually strung 5-6 words together intelligently. Wow. You're talking about gender issues, you know, that assertive women are called the B word, while assertive men are forceful leaders. Women who develop staffers or are maternal, but men are the real mentors. You know, when a woman is being interrupted in a meeting, that's a microaggression. When a woman states an idea and then the man takes it like 5 minutes later, like it was his idea, that's a microaggression. And then, you know, questioning or dismissing someone's gender identity or their pronoun usage. You know, like, oh, what's a they? You can't be a they. What's a they? No, that is a microaggression. So when you're looking at microaggressions across sexual orientation, you know, making an assumption about someone's behavior based on their sexual orientation. Like I talked about earlier, only presenting a point of view from a heteronormative point. You don't sound gay, you don't look gay, or that's so gay. When we come to talking about someone's disability, you know, making assumptions about someone's perceived limitations is a microaggression. Making jokes about mental health. You know, that guy is so rude, he's definitely on the spectrum. Microaggression. Patronizing comments that assume a disabled person suffers in a negative way. You people are so inspiring and resilient despite your disability. Look at what you've achieved. While that sounds like a comment, that's horrible. That's a microaggression. And then minimizing comments about disabilities. An example, come on now, we all have some disability, or I'm so OCD about my filing system. Not cool. Microaggressions related to geography, making statements about where someone lives or assuming that there are no people who are still alive in Egypt. I mean, oh my God. You know, expectations on where something occurred, these things don't happen here. So the shooting in Oxford, Michigan, that was, you know, you heard all that first day, that doesn't happen here. And that was kind of triggering for me. But then on second day, and I realized for the rest of the country it would be perceived that way too, but my son played basketball, his school played Oxford, and it really is this little hamlet off to itself. And it's got this little quaint downtown and all that. And I could see where even the residents would think, but you know, gun violence is everywhere. So these little small hamlets are not immune to violence, to gun violence. Class, those phrases, you know, poor white trash or trailer trash. That's so ghetto. Oh, you haven't been to Europe? You should go. Or, you know, making comments about what parents aren't able to do for their kids, like health care, dental care. Well, I mean, look, these are issues of class. So, you know, disavowing your ill intentions does not protect you, okay? Saying I'm sorry or, oh yeah, just kind of get over it. I said that, why are we still making a deal about it? You know, it doesn't absolve you. You still are a microaggressor. So I want to get to why people don't act. You know, in particular, the targets, like I talked about, I was stunned in the moment. I was fearful of what would happen if I got up and walked away. What will my boss do? And then at the end of the day, you know, if you deal with these all the time, they can be exhausting. And it wasn't until I had started doing this work that I realized I worked in the newsrooms where there were microaggressions every day. I didn't even know that was a term for what I was experiencing on a daily basis. When the bystanders are watching this play out, why do they not say anything? You know, fear of retaliation is what you're talking about. If you were to reprimand the boss, yeah, what's going to happen to me if I say something? You know, some people don't think it's their responsibility to say anything. Sometimes it's fear of losing their ally or their friend. And then some people don't even recognize it as unacceptable because, like I said, if you're in an environment where this is happening all the time, it's just part of the culture. So here's some ways that you can intervene when this happens. You know, you can pull that person aside to validate what happened to them, that, you know, I saw that and I empathize with you. You know, reassuring them of their value as an individual and support and encourage that person. Like when that happened to me, nobody said anything to me. It was just like I was in my office and I think everybody else was so stunned, they went to their respective areas. You know, reassure them that they're not alone, that you saw that. And then sometimes if you're in a position, say if it was someone on your level, Amanda, and you saw them do that, you can like if you can see it coming, sometimes you can kind of head that off, or sometimes you can just in that moment say something to them, pull them aside. You know, you're telling them you recognize that was a microaggression, and disagree with that person, tell them you didn't, their behavior just not warranted in the newsroom. Talk about what that, to the aggressor, what that does, what it's creating in the newsroom. And oftentimes, if you tell a person, you pull them aside and tell them what they did, they don't even recognize it as that. And so with this, that if you realize that you've said something that's offended someone, even, you know, and haven't learned what statements are not good to make, if you feel like you've microaggressed someone, go to that person and say, I am so sorry if I said something that was offensive. I apologize and I acknowledge, you know, the hurt I've caused. Because if you don't, that person is always going to remember. All these times we've been microaggressed, we remember the perpetrator and the fact that they said nothing, but you would remember when they came. That would be so meaningful. So oftentimes, if you're in a position to use your power and your privilege, pull that person aside and have that conversation with them. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of microaggressions in coverage. And I'm going to start with January 26, 2020. So I woke up to this. This is one of the TV stations in Detroit. And I'm looking at my Twitter feed, and everyone from Roland Martin to Kelly Carter, everybody's calling out this station. I even tweeted them too. And it took them 4 hours to change out the photo, no correction, just, okay. No correction, just new picture. Update, right. Didn't even have update on there, right? Okay, so this is, and for sports fans, you'll remember the day January 26, 2020.
Oh, yes.
So that was the morning. Then the very next day, this is the BBC. So their first day news coverage reporting on Kobe's death was using a picture of LeBron. And so I will say, as you know, running features content, Getty Images is a perpetuator of all these mistaken identities of black men. I can't tell you how many times my designer he started compiling a list of images that they mistakenly identified as black men. So I'm sure, but again, how could you not know two of the biggest stars in basketball? But again, if you don't have any diversity on staff, just even ask to make sure, is this the right person? Talking about headlines and the ambiguity of information, this is what caused the newsroom in the Philadelphia Inquirer to erupt. This was like 2 weeks after the death of George Floyd, and their Pulitzer Prize winning architecture critic was writing about buildings and how these buildings in Philadelphia were, you know, part of American history, and how this history, the column itself was about what these protests are meaning to society and history. So the copy editor was that lone person at the end of a shift, and he's like, well, why are we writing about this during the protests? And I only have this much space to say, and so he was thinking, you know, his again, fault lines and interpretation and not having the writer available to have the question. He thought, oh, this is catchy, buildings matter too. He was not trying to equate buildings matter and equate that to a human's life. But again, that's kind of the thought processes that are happening when it's just you in a vacuum and you don't have ambiguity again, right?
So that brings me to my question. Many news organizations, they have that whole social media policy and stance on social issues where it's like Black Lives Matter. We have, for Indigenous, you have the Missing, Murdered, and Indigenous Women movement. And you also have for Asian Pacific Islander movement where news organizations keep telling us to not write that on our social media channels and to not have it stated because it shows a bias in our reporting. How do we navigate that when it's such a massive social issue that hits to our core, to who we are as people? Like, how do we keep true to that and say that we do support those issues because it's about who we are, but then also kick back to the news organization that like this is not something that's political, this is something that concerns people's lives? Like, how do we navigate that sort of like line where they say you can't support us because of objectivity, but we're like, this is not objectivity, this is the matter of someone being who they are and like their lives at stake?
When it comes to the issue again of being taught what is objectivity and where you have to have conversations in your news organizations about, you know, what is it, is this, you know, when you start talking about objectivity, is this an area or something that I cover on a regular basis, you know, or is this something that I don't cover but I'm trying to support it because it's a human rights issue that we're talking about? But those are conversations that are beginning to happen in news organizations, and they're testy ones, right? A lot of organizations like the Washington Post are still trying to figure out what is that fine line, because for so many years, news organizations wanted you to tweet everything and build your brand on social media. But then it's like, build your brand, but you can't tweet this. And it's like, well, how can I build my brand and be this personality? So therein lies the conflict there too. So it's an issue. I think it's one of those case-by-case basis, and that's a conversation you have to have with your editors and your newsrooms in general.
How do you sort of get over that fear of branding yourself? Because as far as I know, with my newsrooms, we don't have any particular policies on what you can and can't tweet. So I don't know what the line is. And I also, maybe because I'm a relatively newer journalist, I don't want my reporting to be disregarded because I had tweeted something that shows opinion in any shape or form.
That's interesting. So your organization doesn't have a social media policy, or what about ethics policies? Do they have? Yeah. Okay. So under ethics, usually that's where that falls, and under ethics, about showing any favoritism to, like whatever. What beach do you cover? The environment. So I guess, when you're, as you're covering environmental issues, support would be shown, like if you're giving donations to them, that's unethical. I guess in tweeting support on an issue, it's one thing to tweet out the story and that you've written about the issue, that's perfectly fine. But if you say, yes, I believe in what, the Sierra Club is doing, that's where you're losing the objectivity of being fair, of what we try our best to do is to not show that favoritism. So that would be the difference in the two. And branding is really about just, it's about the work you do and letting people know the work that you do in social media. That's building a brand. You're the environmental writer. You cover environmental issues. That's how you start building your brand.
I just want to switch it up real quick, just moving away from branding.
Sure.
So we've had these news companies that have issued apologies to their communities. But at what point does it just not become enough? And I ask that because you brought up the Baltimore Sun, but they've also been criticized for hiring 3 white reporters. And even the Philly Inquirer's efforts were criticized because they didn't even include their staff in their efforts. So at what point is it just like hollow?
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was a question I wanted to ask, what you thought of these apologies. But to your question, both the Baltimore Sun and the Philly Inquirer were clients of Maynard, and again, it's building a muscle. So in the issue that you talked about with Baltimore, it's making sure that every time, it's like I had an editor, I was interviewing for a job, and the editor asked me, "Are you familiar with the Rooney Rule?" Are you all familiar with the Rooney Rule? It was okay. It was well, it was a rule implemented by the NFL to make sure that when they're hiring for head coaches, that they have a diverse pool of candidates. And I thought that was odd that it came up in my interview. I was like, oh, and in the end, I think I was Rooney'd. I was like, okay, did she ask me that? But do I think I think that's a good start. But you have to start somewhere, right? And then it becomes still the pressure on the staff to say, okay, you've hired 3 white staffers. Where is the diversity? You have to hold your bosses accountable. That's what newsrooms are doing. In terms of Philly, when we worked with them, as I said, we started with them in March 2020. My folks worked with them all the way through, and staff were a part of those changes, the internal changes that they wanted to make, where they wanted to go from where they were to what is this new future they envision. So staff is playing a a part in that redevelopment, if you will, of the news organization.
You know, I would love for you to kind of share your story of how you've progressed through your career to get to where you are now. I think we can learn a lot from that. And more poignantly, what do you tell young journalists of color, especially, how to navigate imposter syndrome of stepping into spaces where they might be the only one, or you know, they might be the only person who looks like them or came from their socioeconomic background. How do they navigate that to have their own agency even within that and to find their voice to become who they were so they can be great like you? That's my first one. Go ahead.
See, he'll tell you all after this how we met. It was the Detroit 2018 NABJ convention, and he took over my whole booth. I was supposed to be recruiting him and other people, and it was like we were sitting there for probably 2 hours at this booth talking. But it's interesting. My journey, I wanted to be in TV. My cousin studied TV in Murray State. And I never wanted to be on camera. I wanted to be the producer running things. And my professors were like, no, you need to be on camera. But the first hurdle was the voice. And they were like, and because I was a cheerleader, I thought it was cute to get hoarse. So I would scream at the top of my lungs, oh, I'm a horse. And I used to sing too. And so I get to college and they're like, that is not gonna work on TV. So they sent me to voice therapy. I had nodules. So I had to, can you imagine this, your freshman year walking around campus and you can't talk? I was limited to 5 minutes a day, 3 times a day. And they did go away, but that was just a horrible introduction to college life. Like, what's wrong with this girl? She deaf mute, what's wrong with her? But long story short, I got, my professors pushed me in a direction I didn't want to go, and I took my first editing class and loved it. And I was so challenged by how many characters I could get in this one sentence for a headline. But back in those days, they only had one copy editing internship, and it was through Dow Jones, which I didn't learn about till 3 years after I graduated. So after I graduated, I just really was trying to figure out what the heck I was going to do. I have this degree, but what path am I going in? And so anyway, long story short, I ended up at the Courier-Journal as a clerk writer. And that was a kind of an entry-level job if you can decide where you want to go, reporting or editing. And I still wanted to pursue copy editing. And my boss had gone through the Maynard editing program. So I applied for the program, as I told you, got in, and they reassigned me because the Courier-Journal at the time wasn't going to sponsor someone. And I was like, man, I got this guy I'm dating. And he said, who was my future husband? I was like, I don't want to leave Louisville. So they pushed me to, they got a paper in Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Post, which is closed. And that's where I started copy editing. And the reason I wanted to be an editor is because one of the first stories I saw in what was the Louisville Times, the evening paper, it was the fall TV lineup. And Cosby Show had been out for a year. And so they came, one of the networks came up, I guess it was CBS, with their version of a Cosby Show, and it starred Flip Wilson, Gladys Knight, and it was kind of same number of kids. And the writer said, the characters are so similar that even the wives look alike. And I was like, Felicia Rashad and Gladys Knight look alike? What? Oh, no. And so I went to the managing editor. Here I am, this little, clerk writer. And I said, Lynn, do you know what it means? This basically, you're saying, the writer's saying that all black people look alike. And he was mortified. And he said, oh my God, this is not what we want. Oh, I'm so glad you caught that. And I was like, I want to be that person who at the end of the night has the final say on what goes in tomorrow's paper. Because this kind of stuff, that was 1985. So that was been my drive to change the narrative of how we produce work, the framing of work. And, I just took those steps, that guy in Louisville proposed to me. So we found the city where we could work together in Detroit. I worked on the night. Let's talk about, you were there for when we changed the joint operating agreement. Our paper was evening paper, so we had to produce it overnight. So I went from working 3 p.m. to 11 to first 10 p.m. to 7:15 in the morning. Then they said, we don't need you to come in that late. Back it up to come in at 7. So I worked 7 p.m. to 5:15 in the morning for 3 years.
How did you have a family?
That's what my mother said. How are you going to have kids? And I said, well, we'll just stop on the lodge and switch out, Well, God was just good because they were starting a new section called On Detroit. It was solely about the city of Detroit to correct this narrative of Detroit. Unbeknownst to me, they had been looking at me and plucked me as the editor. So I finally got to work days. Because the worst shift, and I got used to that crazy shift, but the worst shift, I was the page 1 designer. And so some nights I would work 11 p.m. to 7:30 in the morning, but the worst one was midnight to 9:15. Oh my God. And trying to drive home, I didn't realize I was pregnant too, so I was tired. And I'm like, Jesus, get me home. I'm so sleepy. And then the noise from the daytime is waking me up. It was just horrible. So yes, that put me on a path of regular, 9 to whatever. And that was my first assignment, the Free Press. And Deborah was responsible for getting me to the Free Press. They were looking for an assistant features editor, and she said, hey, y'all need to talk to Felecia Henderson. So I worked there, got my feet wet in features, and then the news called me back and as features editor. And interesting thing, I didn't want to go back because it was a different culture. But it was a great opportunity, and I really cut my teeth in that department and in that role in terms of really understanding what employee engagement looks like. What does it look like for people to feel ownership in the work that they do? What it feels like to feel like you feel valued and appreciated. So that ended up being kind of a case study for me. I decided, I'm skipping over a whole bunch of stuff now. And I decided to get a master's in organization development to create better organizations. And so when I wrote my thesis on employee engagement, and part of it was like, so how do you know this is true? Well, because it worked in my department. And so after just downsizing and stuff like that, I was just really ready to do something different. So I took a buyout. And then a year later, Deborah led me to the Maynard Institute and in this position. And actually my role as Director of Cultural Competency has evolved because I was working with Table Stakes. I don't know if any of you all know that program, but it's a digital newsroom initiative, which I had lost all hope in print media until I started working with this program. And it's really getting editors to think about how to engage audiences in a different way to get those readers. And really infusing Maynard as a part of that process has really made them look in an even deeper way at how they have neglected communities and really help them improve how they cover everyone. So that role was Table Stakes Coordinator, and so now I'm Director of Cultural Competency.
You have a wealth of experience now. I would love to know, what do you think are some of the most pressing matters in journalism today? And how do you think, what do you think are some solutions that we can strive to work on to get there? I know it's a loaded question, but.
No, well, again, pressing matter is trust and accountability, it's interesting. Deborah was talking last night about relationships. I'll give you we have to develop relationships with sources. They cannot be one-offs because you don't know when that relationship is going to be needed again. A good example is, I've mentioned my husband a couple times, but he wrote a project for the Detroit News on crime in a certain area of Detroit. And maybe 4 or 5 years later, that this pharmacist killed an intruder. It came on the news that night. The next day, it was a brief in the Detroit News. And he said, I think this is a guy that I interviewed back for this series. So it turned out it was the guy he'd interviewed, and he was always, stay curious. That's another thing to always remember. And he wanted to know what it was like to have killed somebody. What was the scene like? What was the moment like? What did you feel? So the guy didn't want to talk about it, but he was actually in the pharmacy, shooting happened on Saturday, he was there on Monday. And the guy, he was shocked, that he even answered the phone. And so he said, I'm going to start therapy, but I don't want to talk. So he checked in with him once a month. And that led to this series by this time he was working for the Wall Street Journal, and it led to a page 1 story about what you do in the moment when someone kills you, and then it became this story of what happened with the robber and blah blah blah. Anyway, the relationship with this pharmacist that he had developed 4 years later led to this 1A story, which led to the Pulitzer Prize. So again, I always use that one as an example. I mean, it's kind of a wild stretch, but the bottom line is, because he had such good rapport with this source, the guy didn't mind talking to him again. And so that's how we have to treat our sources. They are valuable, they're not the one-offs. So, building relationships with the sources, people in your community, so they know that if something goes on in the community, they can call you. So like when George Floyd was murdered, the police reporter had sources in the community. He went down there. None of this reporting from, afar. You need to be on the scene where you're witnessing things yourself, and you're not relying on public officials who may want to slant or change what happened, as in the case of Breonna Taylor. You need to be there with them as well. So it's just that sourcing and knowing people in the community is huge. I will also say, when you're only one in the newsroom, make sure you have mentors. You gotta have those mentors, because when they say the crazy stuff like they said to you and they said to me, and you don't have someone in the newsroom that you can go to and say, oh my God, I can't believe this. You need somebody you can reach out to, you can call, you can text. We need a Zoom. I don't know what to do. And there's a lot of people. I know Rachel said you will have your own mentors. Use them. They will want to hear from you, and just developing relationships. Like we've developed a relationship over the years, but any number of people, I'm available if you ever have any issue you need resolving. But the mentors are so critical, because we've all been through it.
I cannot thank you enough, Felecia Henderson.